вебинара в браузере на компьютере. Вам внизу будет доступно, внизу слева, специальный функционал. Вам нужно выбрать язык, на котором вы хотите прослушивать это выступление. На английском языке, на русском языке или на языке оригинала. Последнее по умолчанию обозначает то, что на каком языке говорит спикер, на таком вы их и услышите. И вам просто нужно, соответственно, внизу обозначить специальную иконку, которая символически отображает земной шар. Дорогие коллеги, попробуйте, пожалуйста, и мы начинаем наш следующий вебинар. С нами доктор Тебохо Моджа, профессор высшего образования, заведующий кафедрой управления, лидерства и технологий Школы культуры, образования и человеческого развития имени Стейнхардта Нью-Йоркского университета, а также Франс Монро, старший заместитель вице-президента по глобальному взаимодействию и инклюзивному лидерству, управления глобальной интеграции разнообразия и стратегических инноваций Нью-Йоркского университета. Отмечу, что Нью-Йоркский университет крупнейший среди частных исследовательских университетов, располагается на Манхэттене, у него есть 2 зарубежных кампуса в Шанхае и Абу-Даби, и по свежему рейтингу Times в 2022 году университет находится на 26-й позиции в мире, поэтому я уверен, это выступление будет достаточно интересным для вас. Дорогие коллеги, пожалуйста, присоединяйтесь, выходите в эфир, будем рады предоставить вам слово для выступления. Сейчас, пока небольшая пауза, призываю вас всех, с одной стороны, быть активными, с другой стороны, соблюдать академическую корректность. Спасибо большое. Франс Монро, добрый день. Рад вас видеть на нашей зимней школе преподавателя. Передаю вам слово для выступления. Как вы?
Hello, good morning. How's everyone? Hope everyone's doing well. Thank you for inviting us to be a part of today's conversation. Who knew we could be in Russia so easily? So I'm using to our advantage the technology to engage in this conversation. My name again is Monro Fran, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Teboho Moja, to say hello. One second. I think we're waiting for it to log on. Oh, wait 1 second. We're dealing with some technical challenges. 1 second, please. Yeah, we're waiting.
Давайте мы тогда пока начнем, господин Монро, Франс, обязательно сейчас решим все технические вопросы.
Teboho, are you here? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll just get started. Okay, next slide. So welcome to our presentation on leveraging strategic partnerships to advance innovation in global education. Today, what we'll do is we're going to give you, this is the slide in Russian. Pause there. And then our next slide. So our time together, what we'll do is we're going to go over internationalization of higher education and the changing landscape over time. We're going to look at historical and current landscape, the landscape of international education. We're going to focus on the impact of the global pandemic on international partnerships and developing international partnerships, both sort of during this COVID era, and also as we move into the next phases of living our everyday lives with COVID, right, with the pandemic. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to explore effective partnerships. What are strategies to develop effective, productive partnerships that benefits all parties and all constituents engaged in that relationship? And then we're going to review a set of examples of partnerships that we have at NYU. It won't be an absolute like exhaustive overview, but we'll just give you some examples of the ways in which that we've continued to embark on developing and accelerating our partnerships, especially during this disruptive moment, which like we're all experiencing all across the globe. So the pandemic. And then we're also going to finally look at the future of international education. Where are we going as we move into the next phases again of living and working with the pandemic at the backdrop of of our profession, at the backdrop of us developing relationships and partnerships going forward. And so that's the overview for what we'll cover today. So New York University, we are the largest private institution in the United States. We also are the most international institution in the United States. We send the most students abroad to study away. Our students study away at mostly all of our global academic centers. We have 13 global academic centers around the world in almost every continent, with the exception of almost every continent. We have our 3 degree granting campuses, New York, Abu Dhabi, and also Shanghai. And then our other locations in Europe, our locations in the continent of Africa, and as well in Australia. And in addition to that, we have numerous partnerships in other places around the world. And so for us, internationalization and international partnerships is a key facet to how we do our education and the ways in which that we do our scholarship and our research with our faculty. And so many exchange programs that we offer across NYU. So let's start first with the framework. So the American Council on Education, which is one of the most premier, there's one of, yes, I see that question. Do we plan to start a branch in Russia? Maybe we'll see after this conversation today. So who never knows? Sometimes these little ideas are prompt new big ideas. So the American Council on Education has a comprehensive model for internationalization, which is probably one of the most premier models that many institutions, at least in the United States and America, uses as a framework. And so at the core of what they think creates a really productive approach to internationalization is making it comprehensive, so that internationalization is rooted in teaching, research, and service. And then these different pillars that informs, the teaching, research, and service as we think about internationalization, which includes leadership and structure. It includes curriculum and co-curricular, so inside and outside of the classroom, faculty and staff support, so the opportunities to develop the faculty and staff in their research, their teaching, their practice. Mobility, so the ability to move in and out across borders, so the opportunity to do that both, I would say, sort of physically, but I also would offer the ability to do that intellectually, the ability to do that through technology platforms as well. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we look at innovative ways to think about international partnerships. And then, of course, the key, which grounds our conversation today, is the importance of partnerships, We'll talk more about, again, later, sort of like productive ways and the ways in which that partnerships can be advantageous, and also the ways in which that historically partnerships perhaps have not been embarked on the ways that have been mutually beneficial to all entities, to all parties. Then the other thing that they say in terms of a comprehensive internationalization strategy and a practice is that it must be rooted in institutional commitment and policy, So using policy to as a foundational part of how do we advance internationalization and international partnerships. And then finally, again, leadership and structure, So we need to think about who's in leadership, what are the leadership questions we're exploring, and also it must look at and explore the ways in which that we structure our partnerships to be productive. And then surrounding all of that is that we must take diversity, equity, and inclusion into consideration. It must be data and research informed, And it must be agile and transformational. What we know, especially during the pandemic, is that those who cannot be agile have been left behind, right? And will continue to be left behind if we're not innovative and thinking about how do we use new practices to advance internationalization and international partnerships. This is the translated version for your review. So let's talk about the different phases of international partnerships in education, right? So the different sort of time periods in which that that internationalization or international partnerships have gone through over time. And we'll do a deeper dive on this just a little bit later in our presentation. So we think that there was the pre-1980s, which goes way, way back, right? Way, way back before even people were getting on flights to travel in different places around the world. And so I don't know, people were sending going by can or sending tablets across the ocean, etc. But this has been a practice that's been along for a very, very long time. So the pre-1980s. Around the 1980s and through the early 2000s, that was where really it started to take off, right? The international partnerships, where many institutions were starting to create memorandums of understanding, right? Like the more memorandums of understanding you have, or MOUs you had, the more prestigious you were seen to be, or the more productive in the partnership space, which we know that is not always true, right? We know that that's a piece of paper. But there was not enough interrogation around sort of the quality of those partnerships and the productivity of those partnerships. And then we move into the pre-COVID era, right? And so that's in the 2000s where people were starting to interrogate the conversations around partnerships. How are the individual, is it just the West that was benefiting from those partnerships? Like who benefits? Are they mutually productive, right? And so those questions around the ways in which partnerships are beneficial to both parties and entities. And then we move into now the COVID era, right? Where travel has been suspended for all intents and purposes. It has had impacts on research, and we'll talk a bit more about that, right? So we're in this space now. And this big question that we must ask ourselves in this space, what are we going to do differently? So that one, right, perhaps there's more access to these international partnerships, that we're able to leverage them, that to be productive for all parties. And that moves us into the future. And we're going to talk about the future in a moment. Just where do we imagine the next phase is going forward as we continue to live with this pandemic at the backdrop of how do we do our internationalization and develop our international partnerships. Again, the Russian version of the slide for your review. So let's talk about, there was a study done by the European Commission in 2018, right, that asked international educators, what were the top 10 drivers or objectives that drove your international partnerships, right? Why? Why did you decide to embark upon these partnerships? So these are the top 10. There were many others, right? But this is just the top 10 that came out of that study. It would be interesting to do that study now, right? As we're in the midst of the COVID era, but common similar topics and interests, right? So that there's a mutually, mutual interest, right? Mutually beneficial interest that really drove drove the partnership development. I have a lot of questions about that, about whether or not that was, is it absolutely factual, right? Or this is conceptually an idea we have of why we've embarked on those partnerships. Developing students' new skills, right? So the opportunity to develop new skills that could be offered by a partner, let's say in Russia, and then also skills that can be beneficial to our students in the United States through that exchange program. Increasing the access to international funding, right? So can we work together in partnership to to identify new funding sources, right, that are going to be beneficial to the research of both or multiple institutions. The other driver, which we know is the case for a lot of our partnerships in New York University, are these existing contacts between staff members and faculty, right? So you already have relationships with someone at a university, ex-university, you're in conversation with them, and you decide to embark on a partnership. Strong leadership with common vision. That's again, another strategy, that you have a strong leader that has a shared practice with another institution. That can be both can be a slippery slope, right? Because it can leave some smaller, less resourced institutions behind, and the opportunities to develop partnerships with research one institutions such as NYU or either an institution like a Harvard, right? When we think about institutions such as that caliber. Enhancing students' employability, right? So the opportunity to prepare our students for the workforce, increasing the quality and relevance of the educational offer, right? So how can we add to our educational offering through classes, through research opportunities, the mobility of our students, giving our students an opportunity to travel, to become global citizens, right? So that was a key driver. Promoting links between higher education and research, which I've already mentioned before, and then again, the synergy. So these are some of the top 10 reasons. But again, I would love to see, like, if we were to do this now today, what that research would say. And then what have been the barriers, right? And these are things that I think will continue to grapple with. So lack of sustainable funding, right, to continue to support those programs. Administrative barriers, which I've experienced in many of my partnerships over time, right, that there's just not, that our systems don't read to each other, right, to make it possible. The complexity of funding, legal barriers, the need to apply to multiple calls every year, right? So just the capacity to keep up in the midst of the busyness, like of our everyday work. Lack of common accreditation like standards, lack of incentives, right? So it's not like one university is getting more out of it than the other. The different academic calendars, which is a big deal, right, in terms of us being on different calendars. And then the number one, which I think continues to be a challenge, right? Student visas, right? The ability to be able to get visas. We know in the United States, we carry this blue passport. It allows us to get visas to many, many different places around the world. That is not the case for even a lot of our partners that we work with currently. So that's something else to consider in terms of a barrier. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague who's been able to join us and had some technical difficulties. Welcome, Dr. Moja. Congratulations.
Thank you, Monroe. So thank you for that background, which really sets the context for which I'm going to talk about. And you ending with the barriers that we have to internationalization and partnerships makes me want us to sort of like step back a little bit and look at some of the historical setup and the changing landscape also. So with this, I want to start by just reminding us about the past, that these partnerships and internationalization actually goes back to the medieval times, where we had lots of scholars roaming around, students roaming around. They were not really formalized as partnerships also at that time. And in some instances, those roaming around or that kind of partnership also was valued in different ways. There were people who valued that, others didn't value it. They saw it as lack of loyalty to your own institution or country. As a specialist living, traveling, going somewhere else, there were instances of people who were murdered even for that, for having done that in the medieval times. I guess the copyright lines were not very clear to some extent, that you are taking something out of one country and taking it to another. At that time, historically, these partnerships or just globalization or internationalization was typically characterized by mobility. For most people, when you start talking about international partnerships, the first thing that comes to their mind is mobility, traveling, going back and forth, and so on. And we have seen now how that has changed, and I'll be touching on that a little bit. We know too that historically, this was a privilege of the few. Both scholars and students who could participate in that were the privileged ones, people who could travel, people who could afford it, people who already had connections and partnerships or relationships with others outside or so. And this, looking at this historical and changing landscape, has been addressed by a number of scholars. Here, I just used two as examples, Albach and De Wet in 2018, and Peters in 2020. There are others, Tefera, so saying, hey, has internationalization come to an end? Is it dead? Do we need to review it? Do we need to recast it? Do we need to rethink it? Which is something that I really like, because some of the voices are actually coming from the countries that haven't been participating, countries that feel they had been left out in the whole thing. So with these changes, what we see presently is that there's less mobility, but there's more interaction, which is a good thing. So we don't associate internationalization or partnerships with mobility. And as Monroe will elaborate later on, we have lots of partnerships.
Спасибо огромное. Наша аудитория благодарит вас за увлекательный доклад. Для всех крайне важно посмотреть на эти проблемы с вашей особенной точки зрения, с вашего особенного ракурса. Есть несколько вопросов, может быть, мы буквально один или два успеем обсудить. Скажите, пожалуйста, на ваш взгляд, как цифровые технологии изменяют международные партнерства? Это волнует нашу аудиторию.
I see digital technology changing in terms of making partnerships and relationships much better. Here we're sitting in New York and we're talking to people all over the world and presenting in Russia, something that in the past we needed mobility to do. So there's a lot of more of resource sharing, expertise sharing, and all without mobility. I don't know if you want to add, Monroe.
Yes, turning my mic back on. Yes, and I would just say that, technology has created more access as well. And so for us at NYU, we've accelerated some of our international partnerships in South Africa and India and Mexico and New Zealand, right? So it's given us the opportunity to be able to work around, sort of the issues that Teboho was saying, mobility, visa issues, the cost of travel, right? And so technology has created a pathway for more innovation, right? Now we have to also be careful. Technology can also be a slippery slope if you don't have access to broadband, you don't have stable internet connection, et cetera. And so it's both and, right? Beneficial, but also can be a barrier to internationalization and developing partnerships.
Or as I was saying, it can be a privilege of the few, the masses and masses of people that don't have.
Спасибо вам огромное. Вас с большим интересом слушал наша аудитория. У нее накопилось очень много вопросов и ремарок. Мы обязательно вам все это передадим. Может быть, это станет началом новых партнерств и новых отношений. И когда-нибудь у нас в России тоже появится отделение вашего замечательного Нью-Йоркского университета. Спасибо большое, дорогие коллеги.